So let's talk about 10 slightly more confusing or unintuitive Warhammer 40k rules that might have more chances for errors than most, with a roundup of common mistakes in-game. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking about some common mistakes and errors that might happen in-game. For this one, rounding up a whole bunch of areas that might be a little bit more confusing or unintuitive, and going with a mix of rules errors that I've either seen personally in games, and a few other ones that people reported when I asked you recently in some channel posts. Let's go through a whole bunch of different areas, talk about the rules and why they might confuse, starting with a few quickfire ones, and then going through a few other sections that are a bit trickier due to their complexity. First up, one small but interesting one from the command phase is that new orders happen at the end of the command phase, not when you draw the secondary objectives. This one's the one command point stratagem from the mission deck that basically allows you to bin off a secondary objective that you can't do this turn and instead replace it with something new. It can be quite a big deal and game impactful one, given that if you draw the right objectives it might push you from defeat to victory sometimes. At least for some things and planning your turn, the time of it could be kind of important. Having to declare it at the end of the command phase rather than when you draw the objectives does mean that you need to make a few decisions before then. Maybe certain other stratagems that might affect in the command phase, or army rules like say orders or oath of moment, or various other things that you need to make decisions about then. If you knew the secondary objectives ahead of time, it might make you make different decisions about those, though I must admit this one to me does feel rather unintuitive. I think it's just player instinct that you get all the secondary objective drawing thing done first, and then you move on to other decisions, even if it doesn't technically work that way. Next up, and one of the most commonly reported things that people see other players doing wrong, particularly newer players, is the moving of models. Perhaps the classic one for players newer to the game is to measure the movement distance from the front of the base or the vehicle that you're moving, and then place it in front of that, so you basically gain the entire distance of the model's base or the vehicle's hull. That was maybe at least fairly easily corrected, at least if the player is actually doing it in good faith and accidentally. Otherwise, one that might need correction is moving models around the end of ruins, because it's only the start and the end positions that really matter with the moves. People can be tempted to sort of miss out the halfway state. So say for example with this Screamer Killer Carnifex moving around a ruin wall, there might be the temptation to measure just up to the corner of that ruin and then back, whereas actually you need to move really quite a lot further than that, given that he's got a big base and you need to get the very back of that base around the corner of the ruin and then move him across. Again, if you measure this one a bit lazily or badly, it could mean that your models are going far further than they're really supposed to be. Then finally, when one movement, it's quite common to forget that pivoting models exist, at least partly because this was done in a digital update mid-edition for some reason, so it won't be printed in any of the rules books that newer players pick up. It can be an incentive to keep your vehicles and models in the same orientation as they were, but otherwise for vehicles and things with an asymmetric base you need to pay 2 inches if you want to change the orientation of them. So if you do pay that 2 inches, you can change that orientation as many times as you want to during their move, so it can make moving around corners a bit easier. And then it's a 1 inch for other models that aren't monsters or vehicles, and they're not on a circular base for things like bikes. In theory, it's a core part of the game now, though a lot of people just go by the more straightforward moving model sort of rules that they had before. The previous rule more being that no part of the model base can exceed the total movement distance, so you can't swing a model around to gain loads of movement that way. Another one that often confuses people is the order and sequencing of who gets to activate in the fight phase, particularly when you throw fights first units into the mix. I think this one often getting misplayed in various different ways, as it's a bit of a wordy section and maybe doesn't feel super intuitive who gets to pick units to fight first. First up, the things that can activate are anything that's actually in engagement range currently, or things that have made a charge move this turn full stop. Anything else can't be selected and that can change over the phase. Otherwise then it's generally a 2-step system. All units that have fights first get to activate first. Having made a charge move gets you the fights first rule, but some datasheets just have it full stop like Lionel Johnson, Lictors and the Judas here. All the fights first units will activate, and then all the units that don't. Within each step, the players alternate activating units, starting with the player whose turn it isn't, though that's not normally obvious in the normal sequence of events. Often a player might just be charging multiple units across the board, so all of those units might have fights first, unless the enemy has any tricks that have fight first or interrupts with a 2 command point stratagem. Generally you just get to activate with all your charging units and then the opponent might swing back. However, if you do charge into enemy units that fight first, because they get to pick the first unit, they'll usually have chance to activate with that one before the thing that charges gets to fight. For example, here's a few melee combats. We've got 2 units of 2 Space Marines, one of them's charged a Lictor and the other one has charged some Termagants, and then there's a Redemptor Dreadnought and Screamer Killer in an ongoing combat. In this situation, all the things with fights first will get to activate first, and that's the Space Marines that charged as they charged. but also the Tyranid Lictor has it on their datasheet. That means that because it's the player whose turn it isn't that gets to select the first unit, the Lictor will be the one that fights first against the Intercessors. Then the Space Marine player will activate with their units, so the units that charge the Termagants next, and then the one that charged the Lictor. And then you get to activate with all the units that didn't have fights first, again starting with the player whose turn it isn't, so it makes sense for the Tyranids player to choose the Screamer Killer Carnifex to activate with, as he wants to get his damage in as soon as possible, just with a small chance that the Redemptor Dreadnought might kill him otherwise unless he gets to strike. Then you go back to alternating once more, so to be the Screamer Killer, then the Dreadnought, then finally those Termagants if they survived. Perhaps some of the biggest mistakes and confusion happen around the fights first units. It might feel kind of intuitive that if you had a fight first unit that is also charging, you might have some sort of super fights first as you're getting it from two different sources, but in reality they don't actually stack in any way. So say if you had a Space Marine Judiceer charge a Tyranid Lictor, it'd still normally be the Lictor that would get the opportunity to fight first, as both models have it, and you alternate starting with the player whose turn it isn't. It is also possible that fights first units might sometimes be able to be hit before they get to activate, if the enemy's done a charge in a clever or opportunistic way. For example, the Space Marine Terminators have charged the Termagants, but not all of them were able to make it into engagement range, so they move themselves kind of close to a Lictor. When it comes to the fight phase, there's only 2 units in melee currently, the Space Marine Terminators and the Tyranid Termagants. Only one of them has fights first, and that's the Terminators, so they'll attack first. And then they get to do the entire process of piling in, fighting and consolidating, and that means that they could pile in to contact the Lictor, hit it in close combat, maybe even kill it and consolidate, or before it even gets to a fight, even though it had fights first. I feel like the bit that people don't understand quite so much for that one is that activating to fight means doing the entire fight process, so pile in, fight and consolidate. You don't pile in and then check halfway through whether or not a different unit could fight now. Before we move on to the rest, I'll just give a quick shout out to today's video sponsor and Tabletop Stronghold, makers of magnetic carry cases based in the USA, who currently have their biggest sale of the year on with big discounts around Black Friday. Magnetic miniature storage and transport tends to be the most popular way to get miniatures from A to B these days, the idea being to mount magnets on the base of the miniatures and then they can all line up on some metal sheets within a storage box, held in place by the magnets so they don't slide or rattle around or damage each other, and you don't need bulky insulating foam, so you can fit loads of miniatures in one very tight confined place. Their particular take on this are the mag cases, boxes made out of notably sturdy and tough MDF, and then within those boxes there are steel trays that can slot in at different levels, so you could raise or lower the level of them depending on the height of the miniatures that you need to transport. Then on the front goes a clear acrylic sheet, so you can see the miniatures that are being stored and transported, as well as them being protected. Broadly speaking, reviews of these things have generally been pretty positive, both down in the YouTube comments and over on Reddit. They also have an MDF terrain set that might be of interest to some of you. That comes a little cheaper if bought with a mag case. Check them out, link down in the video description below if you'd like to, and if you're interested I'll cycle back to them at the end of the video to talk through a few of their specific cases. Thanks to them for sponsoring this one. Next up, for another fairly common 40k rules mistake, is grouping saves that shouldn't really be grouped, happening in a few different times, maybe with feel no pain type saves being grouped together. And also when you have multiple different saving throws in a unit, such as some models having cover but some not. For feel no pain type saves, for failed saves you can't roll them all together. In general you'll need to say roll sets of 2 damage individually per model and then check whether the model is slain before moving on to the next. And if you're doing a shortcut for 1 wound models, maybe roll 1 dice for each miniature first and then only roll the second dice for miniatures that pass the first save, as if they didn't do that they'd all be dead anyway. Perhaps more common than that though, is save rolling a bunch of saves against 1 or more models that have an improved one, and perhaps accidentally gaming in a better saving throw for your entire unit against one sequence of attacks in the first place. Say the squad of Space Marines where there's 1 in cover with a better save, take 10 wounds at AP -2. It's maybe not too uncommon for the player to say roll all 10 of those dice on the higher saving throw, saying that you're taking it on him first, when in reality you shouldn't have been rolling all the dice at that improved profile. You should have been rolling them sort of 1 at a time until that 1 Space Marine dies, and then go on to the lower saving throw that the rest will have when he's likely been shot down after the first few rolls. That one's maybe a slightly more extreme and more obvious example, but it still applies to say if half the squad was in cover and half of them weren't. If say 5 of them were in cover, then perhaps you should be doing them at 5 at a time, just in case the first 5 all wind up failing. Another relatively small but impactful one is to get confused about the turns that units are allowed to arrive from reserve from. For some reason, Games Workshop decided not to make this part of the core rules, but instead have it printed in the mission packs that they have, so the booklet alongside the cards in a lot of cases, where the majority of normal games of Warhammer 40k basically say that reserves can either come in on turns 2 and turn 3, but not normally turn 1 or turn 4 and 5. If you just read the reserve rules from the core book, it's pretty understandable why people might want to arrive reserves on round 1 or rounds 4+, if there's nothing there to forbid them. One exception to this, though, is the units that started on the tabletop but then went into reserve for a rule reason for one reason or another. Maybe a 1 command point stratagem to return to reserves at the end of the enemy's fight phase, or a datasheet rule like these Allarus Custodians. For the units that return to reserves rather than starting there, any turn is fair game. And that means that potentially if the opponent goes first and the Terminators go back into reserve at the end of their turn, then they could effectively get a reserve's arrival turn 1. The same applies for things wanting to arrive later game. If you've returned to reserves, then you can be coming out on turn 4 and turn 5. Moving on to a few of the rules areas that tend to have mistakes made about them just because of the complexity of the rule sets. One that often catches people out is which models get the benefit of cover or not. Some basic ones are relatively easy. If it's just one model targeting one other model, you can choose any point on the model that's shooting, and then if the opposing model isn't fully visible to your model due to an intervening terrain piece like a barricade or the edge of a ruined wall or something, then the enemy model gets cover. A few terrain features apply it a bit differently, including if you're entirely within a ruin, then you get the benefit of cover for being on the area terrain piece. But for the majority of more normal obstacle style terrain pieces, that's the way that it works. When you've got cover, then you improve your saving throws by 1, and that can cause a bit of confusion in itself, as there's just one really specific exception where models of a saving characteristic of a 3+ can't get a +1 to their saves against AP 0. Though that doesn't apply in similar sort of circumstances, say 2+ saves against AP 1, that one does work with cover. If you just got the one model firing and it's targeting an enemy squad, then you look at the enemy models one by one to see whether or not they get cover. So this Havoc can get full line of sight to the Space Marine on the left, so he won't, but the other two will. The middle one's partly obscured to the Havoc, and as mentioned previously, it means that the saves for the Space Marines might need to be slow rolled, as effectively the unit's got 2 different saving throws against attacks made by that Havoc. For area terrain, even if the Space Marines are fully visible, that can be another way to get a cover save. This one only applies to models that are wholly within the ruin base footprint, so out of that squad of Space Marines, the 2 on the right would get a cover save, the rest wouldn't. Again, it could be a fairly common misplayed to give the one that's half on and half off the ruin a cover save, but you have to be wholly within to get that. The other thing that can often trip people up a lot is that 40k's cover rules are weirdly generous when there's an entire squad of things shooting at the enemy, as models in the target squad will gain cover as per the worst position model in the firing squad. So even though the Havoc on the left has got some unobstructed views of a good few Space Marines there, because the top 3 Space Marines will all have a cover save against the one on the right, it means the top 3 get the benefit of cover against literally all the unit attacks, including the ones that can see better. Perhaps the single most unintuitive thing though is that if there's one model that just can't see at all and can't fire at all, they're still counted for whether or not the enemies will get cover. So say if you're shooting with these Havocs all completely out in the open against Space Marines out in the open, because one member of the squad wasn't able to get around the wall and get line of sight, and ruins can grant cover saves, basically all those Space Marines will technically get the benefit of cover there. This one does feel very unintuitive, though it does feel like a situation that no matter which way Games Workshop ruled it, it would either create some weirdness, or just a whole load of micromanagement admin. You probably don't want to be determining every model's cover save from every single model that's firing, really. Vehicles and monsters can be a bit more powerful with drawing lines of sight, as they've got bigger models that they can choose any point on. So against this Predator Annihilator, 2 of the Space Marines wouldn't get cover against him, where 1 would, as drawn from the edge of the model, only 1 can be partly seen. And it also means that really quite big chunky single models can gain the benefit of cover really easily. All it takes is one outlying part of the vehicle being at least partially behind terrain. So the Screamer Killer Carnifex in this case could just have 1 claw behind terrain and gain the benefit of cover, or even just have a part of its base behind cover, which definitely does feel a bit weird. I can see why both players might just assume that it didn't have cover if it was the tiniest bit that was obscured. I choose to see this thing as a bit more of an abstraction myself, representing models trying to take cover behind nearby things in a bit more of a dynamic way than just standing there and waiting to get shot. That's only half the story with terrain complexities though, as there's the other big question of what gets line of sight in the first place. And another really common rule to get misplayed in various different ways is the obscuring ruins type rule, what can draw line of sight and what can't. I feel like one of the main causes of trouble with this one is that terrain sets vary quite so differently. Some of them might be a bit more obvious how they're supposed to be interpreted in Warhammer 40k, Some fun narrative bits really might not fit into Games Workshop's rules quite so well, and a fair few house rules and ways people like to play with their own terrain sets might also confuse people. To iron out misunderstandings or mistakes, it does feel like one of the areas to be clarified before the start of the game. If there's any unclear terrain bits, it's worth denoting what their boundaries are. If you're playing with ruins rules for Warhammer 40k, it generally assumes that the ruins that you're playing with have a base, often increasing the footprint of that ruin at least a little bit. Plenty of terrain sets out there don't really have bases, so it's often worth clarifying for the pieces that you're playing with if they don't have one, if you do want to use the ruins area terrain style rules. Another common one that could be a mistake for both players are how are you playing the windows on the ruins. As part of the core 40k rules, if you have them, then they won't actually block any line of sight to within the ruin itself, so if you say you had a guard squad take up residence there, they could both shoot out of the ruin and other things could shoot into the ruin to hit them. Quite a lot of tournaments and things house rule the ruins to block line of sight at least on ground floors though, and that does seem to get at least a fair amount of uptake in more casual play as well. It's a reasonable enough way to actually encourage people to go into the ruins rather than just hang out just behind them. But if you are wanting to play that way, it's probably something that should be discussed before the game, as it's not actually any part of the core 40k rules to house rule that ground floor ruins are closed. For the actual ruin line of sight rules themselves, the general gist for visibility is that provided that you can physically draw line of sight, units can draw lines of sight into ruins, but not out the other side of them. So in this example, the grey rectangle represents a top-down view of a ruin, the dark wall is a wall with windows, the Chaos Havoc can draw some physical line of sight to all three of the Space Marine squads, but due to the ruins obscuring rules, the only ones they can actually shoot are the ones at squad C, they're actually within the ruin, the ones at B are the other side of a wall, so you'd have to shoot both in and out of the ruin, which the rules prevent, and then the one that could be a mistake that catches people out are the ones at A. There's actually no walls in the way at all for him, but the base of the ruin does technically block line of sight. Though I must admit that one does always feel like a bit of a weird area, and you can technically have line of sight blocked by a chunk of perfectly flat ground, just because it's the way that the ruin's terrain footprint extends to. If the Havoc moved too wholly within the ruin though, he'd be able to draw line of sight to all three of those provided he could physically get line of sight to them, and the Space Marines at A and B would also be able to draw line of sight to him. Games Workshop have their own diagrams that illustrate a similar sort of thing. On the bottom left there's a repulsor that can draw line of sight to things normally, and then things that are within a ruin, but not things the other side. But then if it goes wholly within the ruin, then it's able to shoot all three things. One of the other scenarios that's a better source of mistakes as well is how to treat a model that's halfway into the ruin and halfway out. When you have the Space Marine repulsor just towing into the ruin, so it's partially inside it but not wholly inside. In this situation, you still can't draw a line of sight outside of the ruin, so it still can't shoot those termagants at the top at A. Though now it has its footprint within the ruin, the termagants at A can target the vehicle itself. It means that you sort of have one-way line of sight blocking, and it really does incentivize people not just to put units partially into ruins, either hang out behind them, or go wholly within or around if you want to draw some line of sight, but nudging at least part of a model within doesn't really gain much of an advantage, otherwise you'd see people doing this literally all the time. This is the only scenario in which the towering rule has a big effect now, and the advantage of big tall knights and monoliths and things is that if you tow into a piece of ruined area terrain with them, then they can draw line of sight out the other side, and it can mean that they can get some more advantageous lines of sight due to their height. If the knight's completely outside of the ruins though, the towering rule doesn't give you any advantage, and you still wouldn't be able to see the units over it. Finally, just to add in one more slightly unusual edge case to this, certain models overhang their bases either by a greater or lesser extent, and in their rules commentary, Games Workshop said that these are basically ignored for drawing lines of sight over and through ruins. It means that if you have this Tyrannid Screamer Killer Carnifex here, and he's just prodding his claws so they're just within the ruin, it means that he's still going to be obscured behind it, and the Space Marines the other side of the ruin wouldn't be able to shoot him, and that would also apply for Towering Knights as well. Overhanging bits not able just to prong into the ruin to see over. That rule can make those kind of units just that little bit easier to hide behind ruins if they have got big overhangs on the models. Provided the base is behind the ruin, then they can't be shot from the other side of it. And bear in mind though that doesn't apply to lines of sight around ruins, which is still done in the normal way, any part of model to any part of the model. So if his claw was pronging around the corner as opposed to into the base of the ruin, then that Space Marine on the right will be able to get a line of sight into him. I feel like it's not too hard to see why ruins create some confusion. It often can be a really big deal as to whether or not you've got parts pronging into the ruin or entirely behind it. Another area that always gets brought up with misplaced rules is consolidation. This one basically being the little optional follow-up movement that happens after you've piled in and then made all your attacks and the opponent removed any models that have been the cause of that. Often the main motivations might be to ensure that the opponent's units that you're fighting remains engaged and won't be able to just back away and act freely next turn, to move up to tag a different unit and annoy them, or potentially to move a unit onto an objective. One of the more common misplays of Consolidation is just not bothering to do it in the first place, given that it's a bit of a technical fiddly movement style thing, and most newer players might find the damage dealing and actual killing part of the close combats to be the only important bit, and not really be quite at the level where Consolidation is obvious in what it achieves. Otherwise, even if you do remember to consolidate in the first place, there are some quite big restrictions on what you can do with it. First up, you can only do it at all if you can either end within engagement range of an enemy unit, and if that's not possible, then you can choose to end in range of an objective marker. So if the enemy unit is an option, then that's got to be the one that you go for, even if the objective marker might be the decision that you'd want to go for. If neither of those are possible though, your unit just stays stock still and doesn't consolidate after fighting. The move itself is relatively straightforward. You do it model by model, and it's done very similar to a pile-in move. You get 3 inches of movement for each model. You move them in turn, and they must move closer to the nearest enemy model to them and into full base contact with an enemy model if that's possible. It means that if they're already in full base contact, then they can't move at all, as they're already as close as they can possibly be. And it can create some unusual situations where, due to needing to go towards the closest model, you might not actually be able to get into an engagement range with the unit. Weirdly enough, you might be screened out by your own models. Otherwise, only if getting into engagement range isn't an option, you can go towards the objective marker. And another common question or misunderstanding for this one is whether or not you're able to consolidate once you're within scoring range of an objective marker. And the answer to that is yes, you generally can, though again each model needs to be moved actually towards the centre of the central objective marker itself, though not necessarily directly towards it, so you could just end very fractionally closer and sort of use your move to cycle around that objective marker, which might get them into a bit of a safer position behind a ruin or into cover or something. Or that's quite a lot to take in. Say for example if you had this Space Marine squad that charged the termagants, killed a bunch of them, and then was about to consolidate, the Space Marine at B might have the option of tagging the Hive Guard, provided he's able to remain in unit coherency with the rest of his squad while he does so. Though even if he is within 3-inch range to get onto that objective marker, he wouldn't have the choice to do so, as he has to move to base the Hive Guard, as that takes precedence. The other 3 Space Marines not in engagement range have the last termagant as the model they must consolidate towards. They can opt not to make a movement to maintain unit coherency with B perhaps, though if they move, if they can get into base contact with that termagant, then they must do. Finally for this one, let's talk about some out-of-sequence shooting rules like big guns never tire and firing deck. Again, some of the rules that feel a bit more obtuse and have a few things lurking in the designer's commentary to clarify them. I think it's not really very many people who read through the big guns never tire rule once and be able to perfectly understand what Games Workshop meant for it. Basically the upshot of it is that in the shooting phase, vehicles or monsters within engagement range of an enemy unit can fire out of that melee into other targets or into that unit itself. Those shots are resolved at -1 to hit, and you can't fire blast weapons specifically into the same unit that you're actually in melee combat with. Other shooting restrictions apply as well, so say if those orcs were also in melee with some Space Marine infantry as well, you wouldn't be able to target them. On the flip side, if it was the orc player's shooting phase, you'd be able to fire at that repulsor with other units outside, though they'd be -1 to hit it. I have seen people get confused about various bits of that process. Maybe the single thing that catches the most people out though is the interaction with Overwatch and other out-of-phase shooting rules. And basically big guns never tire is very specifically only allowed in the shooting phases and not outside of that. So certain rules that allow you to shoot as if it were your shooting phase still means that big guns never tire won't apply. Games Workshop specifically calls out Overwatch as a stratagem that you're not able to use with big guns never tire rules. So it could be quite unhelpful if, say, you have a Guard Hellhound or other big scary gun tank that's locked in melee, you can't fire Overwatch with things that are moving past nearby. And it can apply to other rules. For example, the Lehman Russ Tank Commander's Shoots in Death special rule. If your tank is slain in the shooting phase, then usually it's no problem, but if you're slain in melee with something within engagement range, then it is a big problem, and you wouldn't be able to use that rule. I feel like the Overwatch rule doesn't necessarily help this as well, saying that you can fire Overwatch at the end of a charge move, and in reality that's very rarely going to happen. I believe that you can declare it with another unit that's shooting against something like an enemy monster or vehicle that charged in with something else, but besides that, uses of it are pretty scarce. Lastly, and kind of related to that, are the transport rules, turning off abilities, and firing decks. This one feels like another common way that could trip people up. In particular, units within transport sort of being counted as a super not on the board and not active kind of state, even more so than being held in reserve. Basically, if your characters have any special rules and they're inside a transport vehicle, those special rules can't take effect, including abilities that come from enhancements as well, unless the rule in question very specifically states that you can still use it while embarked. For example, a Tower Ethereal wouldn't be able to farm its command point ability in the command phase if it was embarked inside a Devilfish, though if the model was on the board you would be able to do so, and even if it was in reserves you'd be able to do so as well, as the rule has no stipulation as to being on the battlefield. It just flat out doesn't function if you're within transports though. Another way in which this one can specifically trip people up is the firing deck special rule, which is kind of representing the unit inside firing out of the transport with a bunch of small arms and things. But the way Games Workshop have made this one happen is to count the guns as actually being mounted on the transport model itself for the phase, as opposed to reflecting the abilities and talent of the squad firing out. And it means that you won't be able to use any special rules or abilities of the unit or the leader character in question while they're shooting. Say for example, if the unit that was embarked had a character with rerolls, you wouldn't get those rerolls on the shooting attacks, but if the transport was allowed to reroll hits or something, then those shots would be able to make use of that. Otherwise, Games Workshop fiddled with the one-shot weapons to say that you just flat out can't fire them with firing deck, and it also doesn't interact with Overwatch as well. Again, it only functions during the shooting phase, so you won't get all those extra shots in the opposing turn when your unit's overwatching. Again, it is one that feels like it's maybe a slightly over-complex solution, and does feel a touch unintuitive, even if it does mean that you're not having to technically use profiles for models not on the table, I suppose. In any case, let me know your thoughts as to a few common rules mistakes in Warhammer 40k. What things do you see players regularly getting wrong on the other side of the tabletop? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below, or any other expansion on the examples I've covered here. That's about it for this one, though before I go, I'll just circle back to Tabletop Stronghold, the video sponsor, and talk through the specific offerings for their range of magnetic carry cases, currently discounted in the Black Friday sales. Here's the amount of miniatures that you can fit on one tray for them, around 90 odd 25mm bases or 6 knight armigers or so. And then those steel trays rank up in different cases of different heights. This mini one's the smallest one, £58 or $65 during their big sales, and still at least a fair amount of room for this one with some big tanks and Terminators. Those prices include delivery, though as exclusive at any VAT or sales tax. Then we've got the standard size mag case. This one's £89 or $100 during the sales. I'll leave the dimensions on the screen. This one's really quite a lot taller, with room for a big Chaos Knight on the ground floor as you can see here. And all the mag cases come with a starter supply of magnets to mount to the bases. Then there's the really big XL one, basically 2 of the previous attached side by side. There should be some room for some entire collections here. You can see a massive Baneblade on the top left. And there are a few buying options for whether or not you want more or fewer of the big steel trays. If you choose an example with fewer of them, then the price goes down a bit. Beyond that, they also have their MDF terrain set as well. Again, cheaper than normal, and cheaper still if you buy it in a combined bundle with one of the mag cases, which might be of interest to some of you out there. In any case though, thanks to them for sponsoring this one. Check them out, link down in the video description. There's not too much longer left on their Black Friday sales. That one's over in early December. I'll leave that there for now though. Feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see more like this. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming, with new ones out just about every day. If you've been enjoying the videos on the channel, Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well. You can find that linked in the video description. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link's in the video description below. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.